In this gripping story about racism in America, Leonard Price, a successful black CEO, returns to his small hometown only to face relentless harassment and injustice from Sheriff Greer, a corrupt lawman hiding behind his badge. Greer's blatant prejudice fuels a campaign of intimidation, false accusations, and abuse of power, as Leonard becomes a target simply for standing his ground. The story exposes the infuriating reality of a racist system, where those in authority exploit their power to silence and oppress, forcing Leonard to fight back against overwhelming odds. Will truth and justice prevail in a town built on lies? The cafeteria was unusually quiet for lunchtime. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft beams across rows of empty tables. The steady hum of the hospital above contrasted with the emptiness below. Robert Harris wiped down the last table near the far corner of the room, his back stiff from hours of cleaning. At 48, he'd spent more than 2 decades as a custodian in this hospital. Long shifts had left their mark on his body, but his work ethic had never wavered. To Robert, this wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility. He reached for his card when a loud crash echoed from behind. Whirling around, his heart jumped. A small child, a girl no older than 6, lay sprawled on the floor, her body limp, her face turning pale. Robert froze for only a second. Then instinct took over. "Hey, hey," he called, dropping the mop and rushing to her side. He knelt, hands steady, but his voice urgent. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Other cafeteria staff turned toward the commotion, but no one moved. He spotted the tray near her, its contents spilled, milk, a sandwich, and a crumpled cookie packet. It looked like she'd choked. Robert's training kicked in. CPR. He tilted her head back, checking for breath. None. He pressed 2 fingers under her neck, searching for a pulse. Faint, too faint. Time slowed as the noise of the cafeteria dissolved into silence. "Call the nurses," he shouted. Someone nearby scrambled for a phone. Robert took a breath. There was no time to wait. "Come on, baby, stay with me," he muttered under his breath as he began chest compressions. His hands were strong but gentle, working with the steady rhythm he had learned in training courses years ago, training he never thought he'd need. 1, 2, 3, 4. He kept counting silently, his pulse pounding in his ears. The morning sun spilled its golden light across the quiet town of Summerview, illuminating manicured lawns, historic brick buildings, and the soft hum of life in the sleepy streets. On its surface, Summerview appeared pristine, a postcard-perfect image of Southern charm. But beneath the cobblestone veneer was a town stitched together by old traditions, whispers of unspoken biases, and a long memory for who belonged where. Leonard Price knew this better than anyone. At 44, Leonard was the kind of man who drew attention wherever he went, though he never sought it. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded rooms, Leonard had the quiet grace of someone who had already won life's hardest battles. A black man who had worked his way up from nothing, Leonard now sat as the CEO of Price and Wade Enterprises, one of the region's most successful real estate development firms. His empire stretched across 3 states. Skyscrapers bearing his company's emblem stood tall as testaments to his vision. Yet, Leonard still lived in Summerview, in the very town that had once tried to make him invisible. It was a choice that often puzzled people. Leonard didn't care for flashy cars or sprawling mansions. His home, a sleek, modern bungalow tucked into the woods at the edge of town, was deliberately unassuming. He spent his mornings with black coffee brewed in a chipped ceramic mug and soft jazz humming from the record player in his kitchen. He could have lived anywhere, but Summerview, with its contradictions and challenges, was still home. That morning, Leonard found himself in a place he loved most, a small diner on the corner of Magnolia and Elm. It was the kind of place where sunlight streamed through windows smudged from years of kids' hands, where the menu hadn't changed in decades, and the air always smelled of bacon grease and burnt toast. The little bell above the door jingled as he walked in, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp, white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He carried no briefcase or entourage, just the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent years proving his worth. "Morning, Lenny," called Martha, the the diner's owner, as she wiped down the counter. A stout, older woman with a gruff voice, softened only by her kindness. Martha had known Leonard since he was a boy, back when his mother would scrape together change for pancakes on Sunday mornings. "Morning, Martha," Leonard replied with a small smile. He tipped his head to a couple of farmers hunched over their coffee in the corner booth. "Slow morning?" "Always is," Martha said, gesturing to the half-empty room. "But give it an hour. You'll have every retiree in Summerview complaining about the cost of eggs." Leonard chuckled softly, sliding into his usual seat at the counter. The diner was half full now. A family eating waffles at the far end, an older couple sharing a newspaper, and a young man in a suit, clearly out of place, tapping his pen against the edge of his coffee cup. Leonard noticed things like this. He was observant by nature. Years of moving through rooms where people doubted his place had taught him to watch, listen, and wait. Martha set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, her rough hand giving his shoulder a gentle pat. "How's business, Lenny? They keeping you busy?" Leonard nodded, blowing on the coffee. "Busy enough. We're finalizing the new residential complex outside Atlanta this week." Martha whistled low. "Big man doing big things. But you always come back to us small folk." There was affection in her tone, but Leonard didn't miss the subtle distinction. Us small folk. As if, despite knowing him for decades, even Martha couldn't quite picture him in boardrooms and corporate towers. "I like the quiet here," Leonard replied simply. He was halfway through his coffee when the young man in the suit called out to Martha, his voice sharper than it needed to be. "Mom, can I get a refill, or do I have to wait all day?" Martha raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You can wait a minute like everyone else, sweetheart." The man sighed, muttering something under his breath as he checked his watch. Leonard turned slightly on his stool, studying him. Young, early 30s maybe, with slick back hair and the kind of arrogance that came from having too much to prove. His suit was nice, but his impatience was louder. Leonard watched as the man drummed his fingers on the table, looking around the diner like it offended him. His gaze landed briefly on Leonard, lingering just a second too long before flicking away. It wasn't unfamiliar. Leonard had seen that look before. The type of gaze that scanned him and dismissed him in the same breath. He didn't let it bother him. Not anymore. "Expecting someone?" Leonard asked conversationally. The man looked up, startled. He hadn't expected Leonard to speak. "Excuse me?" Leonard gestured to the man's watch and notebook on the table. "Seems like you're in a rush." The man tilted his head, clearly sizing Leonard up. "Just trying to make sure my time isn't wasted. I'm meeting someone for a property deal. Supposed to be a big shot around here." He smirked, as though he found the whole idea amusing. "But so far, this town isn't exactly impressive." Leonard raised his eyebrows slightly. He didn't correct him. Instead, he turned back to his coffee, hiding a smile. "I'm sure you'll find what you're looking for," Leonard said evenly. The man didn't respond, now distracted by his phone as he typed out a hurried message. Leonard sat quietly, the sounds of the diner settling around him. The clatter of dishes, the hiss of the griddle, Martha grumbling softly about rude city folk. Moments later, the diner door swung open again, and a woman in a sleek pantsuit stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She paused, scanning the room before spotting the man at the far booth. "There you are," she said, exasperated. "You didn't even wait for me to arrive." The man stood, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves. "Well, we're here now. Let's get this over with." Leonard caught Martha watching the exchange from behind the counter, shaking her head with a smirk. "City folk," she whispered to him. "Always in a hurry." Leonard's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his screen lighting up with a message from his assistant, Camille. "Your 10 a.m. appointment is waiting at the diner. Should I send them to your office instead?" Leonard smiled faintly, typing back. "No need. I'm already here." He set his phone down and drained the rest of his coffee, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he slid a crisp $20 bill onto the counter. "Leaving so soon, Lenny?" Martha asked. "Got business to tend to," he replied, standing and adjusting his sleeves. Martha gave him a curious look, but said nothing. Leonard turned and walked toward the booth where the man and woman were now deep in conversation. their voices clipped and professional. "Excuse me," Leonard said, his tone polite but firm. The man looked up, irritated. "What?" Leonard extended a hand toward the woman. "Leonard Price. Pleasure to meet you." The woman froze mid-sentence, surprise flashing across her face. "Mr. Price?" she asked, shaking his hand quickly. I wasn't expecting." Leonard turned to the man, who was now staring at him with wide eyes. "You must be the prospective buyer," Leonard said smoothly. "It's good to see you're eager." "I appreciate that." The man blinked, scrambling to recover. "Wait, you're Leonard Price?" "That's right." Leonard offered a calm, measured smile. "Shall we talk business?" For a moment, the diner was silent, save for the hiss of the griddle and the faint clink of dishes. The young man looked as though he'd swallowed a lemon. Leonard had seen it before, the way realization dawned, the way assumptions shattered. But he never lingered on it. Leonard gestured to the booth. "Please sit. I'd hate to waste your time." As the man slowly lowered himself back into the seat, Martha caught Leonard's eye and gave him a wink. He nodded back, his small smile unshakable. Leonard sat in the diner booth, hands clasped lightly on the table, as the woman across from him pulled out her leather folder and neatly organized a stack of papers. The man who had dismissed Leonard earlier, now visibly uncomfortable, avoided making eye contact, fiddling with his pen as though it were suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. The quiet tension between the two hung like thick smoke. "Mr. Price," the woman began, her voice polished but hurried. "I'm Andrea Caldwell, from Weston Partners Realty. My colleague here, Jason Hughes, is handling the initial evaluation on your behalf. We weren't expecting to meet here casually." Leonard's gaze didn't falter. "It's my way of keeping things grounded, Ms. Caldwell. I like to see potential properties in person, not through a slideshow." Jason finally found his voice, though it came out clipped and defensive. "I'm surprised a man of your standing would take this kind of time for small-town deals like this." There was subtle, small-town deals, words that masked deeper meanings. Leonard had encountered them all before. He smiled faintly, his voice steady. "If there's value, I'm interested. Size has nothing to do with it." Jason's eyebrows rose slightly at Leonard's measured confidence, but he didn't push further. Andrea cleared her throat, sensing the need to redirect. She laid out the paperwork, property specs, zoning details, and the usual legal jargon. As she spoke, Leonard listened intently, asking sharp, targeted questions. Andrea answered them professionally, though a thin thread of nervous energy ran beneath her words. It wasn't the questions that unsettled her. It was Leonard himself. "They didn't expect me." The thought lingered as Leonard glanced at Jason, whose discomfort grew with each passing minute. "Mr. Price," Jason cut in suddenly, leaning forward in a half-hearted attempt at authority. "Forgive me for asking, but are you sure a deal like this is worth your time? Summerview's got potential, sure, but it's modest compared to what I hear Price and Wade usually chase." Leonard's dark eyes met Jason's, calm as ever, but holding an unspoken weight. "Why don't you let me worry about that?" Jason's lips tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached for his coffee cup and knocked it over in his haste. Liquid spread across the table, soaking several sheets of paper. "Damn it," Jason muttered, jumping to his feet. Martha appeared with a towel, wiping up the mess with practiced ease. "Not your day, huh?" she quipped, casting Jason a look that danced somewhere between pity and amusement. Jason didn't answer, mumbling something under his breath as Andrea gathered the now-stained papers, embarrassed. Leonard, meanwhile, stayed perfectly still, his calm demeanor unshaken. They had just wrapped up when the diner door opened with force, the little bell above it jangling wildly. 3 uniformed police officers stepped inside, their heavy boots scuffing the linoleum floor. The moment they entered, the air shifted, the easygoing diner hum replaced with an underlying tension. Leonard's eyes flicked toward the doorway, his posture remaining relaxed. The officers were young, barely in their 30s, their belts weighed down by radios, batons, and guns. At the center of them was Officer Sheriff Greer, Summerview's newest sergeant, a man whose crisp uniform and rigid movements suggested he had something to prove. The trio walked straight to Martha behind the counter. "Morning, ma'am," Greer said, voice clipped. "We had a call about a disturbance." Martha's brow furrowed. "Disturbance? Here?" Greer's gaze slid past her, scanning the diner before landing on Leonard. It lingered just a beat too long. Leonard saw the shift. Greer's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line as though something didn't sit right. "We got a report," Greer continued, not taking his eyes off Leonard, "about a suspicious individual causing a scene." The words were calm, but they landed like a stone in Leonard's chest. Martha's voice rose, her indignation clear. "Suspicious. Leonard's been here the whole time, officer. He hasn't caused a lick of trouble." Greer ignored her, walking straight toward Leonard's booth. The other two officers followed, hands twitching near their belts. "Sir," Greer said, his tone neutral but tinged with something colder. "Mind showing me some ID?" Leonard didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, his eyes steady. "What seems to be the problem, Officer Greer?" Jason and Andrea watched in silence, their unease unmistakable. Martha had frozen behind the counter, her towel gripped tightly in one hand. "We're responding to a call," Greer repeated, his voice firm. "We need to verify your identification." Leonard took a slow breath, his jaw tight. He had learned long ago that there were moments when his dignity would be challenged, and the choice he made next would shape how things unfolded. Calmly, he reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. "I don't see why that's necessary, but here you go." Greer snatched the ID from his hand, studying it like it might reveal some secret. "Leonard Price," he read aloud, almost skeptically. "And what is it you're doing here, Mr. Price?" Leonard's voice remained even. "Having coffee. Same thing I do every morning." Greer raised an eyebrow. "Aha! Someone called and said you were bothering folks." Jason shifted awkwardly in his seat, avoiding Leonard's glance. Leonard immediately understood. Of course. He fought to keep his expression neutral. "That's funny," Leonard replied, folding his hands on the table. "I've been sitting here quietly, speaking with these two." He gestured to Jason and Andrea, whose discomfort had only deepened. Greer frowned, glancing between Leonard and Jason. "Sir," he said, turning to Jason, "you called this in?" Jason froze. The silence stretched a beat too long before he stammered. "No, I didn't mean to call anyone. I said I thought something was odd, that's all. I didn't say to send the police." Greer's eyes narrowed as he turned back to Leonard. "Well, we're here now." Leonard tilted his head slightly, his composure unshakable. "And now you know I'm not causing a disturbance." Greer stared at him, jaw tight. It was clear he was looking for something, anything to justify his presence. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" Leonard added, his voice sharpening ever so slightly. Greer straightened, puffing out his chest. "Not anymore. Just doing my job." Leonard held his gaze for a long, silent moment, forcing Greer to be the first to look away. Without another word, Greer turned on his heel and walked back toward the counter. His two officers followed, though one of them gave Leonard a lingering glance that sat somewhere between curiosity and discomfort. The door jingled as the trio left, the tension ebbing like a tide. Martha let out a loud sigh of frustration. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. "You don't deserve that, Lenny." Leonard forced a small smile. "I'm used to it, Martha." Across the booth, Jason stared at his hands, guilt now coloring his face. He opened his mouth as though to say something but stopped short, his words catching in his throat. Leonard stood slowly, adjusting his sleeves. He took his wallet and ID, sliding them back into his pocket. "I think that concludes our meeting," he said to Andrea, ignoring Jason entirely. "I'll have Camille review the paperwork later this week." Andrea nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Price." Leonard looked down at Jason, who still couldn't meet his gaze. "Be careful what you assume about people, Mr. Hughes. It'll save you embarrassment." With that, Leonard turned and walked toward the door. As he passed Martha, she reached out, her voice quiet but firm. "You're too good for this place." Leonard paused, giving her a small nod. "Thanks for the coffee, Martha." The bell chimed softly as he stepped outside into the bright morning sun. The air was cooler now, and Leonard inhaled deeply, letting the tension unravel from his shoulders. Behind him, the door to the diner closed, muffling the sounds within. He glanced down the street, where Officer Greer stood by his patrol car, watching him. Leonard met his gaze, unwavering, before calmly walking to his own car, a polished black sedan that gleamed in the sunlight. Leonard slid behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel tightly for just a moment. He exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to settle. He wasn't angry. Not exactly. He was tired. Tired of the assumptions. Tired of the small-town eyes that saw his skin before his worth. He started the engine, his resolve settling like iron. The day would go on. He had more meetings, more deals to finalize. He would keep moving forward, as he always had. But as he drove down Magnolia Street, Leonard couldn't shake the feeling that today was just the beginning of something much larger. Leonard's fingers tapped a steady rhythm against his desk, the sound of rain pattering softly against the window of his office. It had been 2 days since the encounter at the diner, and while he hadn't let it derail him, the undercurrent of frustration lingered. He could ignore the microaggressions, but the confrontation with Officer Greer had stuck with him like a thorn beneath the surface. Now, Leonard sat in the conference room of Price and Wade's Summerview office, a sleek, glass-walled space that overlooked the town square. His assistant, Camille, stood nearby, holding a tablet as she rattled off updates on the firm's latest projects. And we've received final approval for the Jackson Heights development. Zoning permits are cleared, so we're set to break ground by next month, Camille said, her voice calm and professional. Leonard nodded, barely hearing her. His mind wandered back to the diner, Greer's tone, Jason's discomfort, the silent message behind it all. A quiet voice within him warned that this wasn't over. Camille, Leonard said abruptly, cutting through the silence. Pull me the records for the Summerview courthouse renovation deal we finalized 2 years ago. I want all the paperwork, contracts, bids, everything. Camille paused, startled. Of course. Anything specific you're looking for? Leonard's expression was unreadable. Call it a hunch. An hour later, Leonard sat alone in the dim glow of his office, papers spread across his desk. 2 years ago, Price and Wade had secured a lucrative deal to modernize the aging courthouse, a project Leonard had championed to breathe life into Summerview's infrastructure. Yet something about it gnawed at him now. The courthouse, with its looming stone facade and whispers of its outdated practices, was emblematic of the town's deeper issues. Leonard flipped through the bid proposals and subcontractor agreements. At first glance, everything appeared above board. But as he reviewed the files, a pattern began to emerge. The winning bid, submitted by a smaller firm out of Milford, listed expenses far higher than comparable bids from larger, more experienced contractors. Leonard frowned, his instincts sharpening. This doesn't add up, he muttered under his breath. The next morning, Leonard parked his sedan outside the Summerview courthouse. The rain from the night before had left slick puddles across the asphalt, and the air felt heavy with humidity. As Leonard stepped inside, he adjusted his cuffs, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floors. He had an appointment with Mitchell Crane, the courthouse clerk, a man Leonard had known for years. Mitchell was a cautious figure, perpetually stuck between his loyalty to the town and his growing awareness of its flaws. He was a man of routines, the kind who knew when to keep his head down and when to speak up. Leonard found Mitchell in his office, a cramped room stacked with old files and the faint smell of stale coffee. Mitchell glanced up from his desk as Leonard entered, surprise flickering across his face. Leonard, Mitchell said, standing quickly and extending a hand. Didn't expect to see you here today. Leonard shook his hand firmly, his gaze steady. I've got a few questions, Mitchell. I'm hoping you can help. Mitchell's smile faltered slightly. Of course. Anything for you. Leonard pulled the papers from his folder and spread them across Mitchell's desk. These are the bids for the courthouse renovation. I reviewed them last night, and something doesn't sit right. The winning bid was inflated, significantly. Mitchell's expression stiffened, his eyes darting to the documents. Leonard, you know as well as I do that the committee approved that bid fair and square. Fair and square. Leonard's voice remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it. You and I both know that's not how things work in Summerview. Mitchell's shoulders sagged slightly, and he looked away, as if searching for the right words. Leonard, it's not that simple. Make it simple for me, Mitchell, Leonard replied, leaning forward. Who pushed that bid through? Mitchell hesitated, chewing his lip. Finally, he muttered, the sheriff's office had some sway in it. Greer was just a deputy at the time, but he's tight with the firm that won the contract. There were rumors of kickbacks, nothing proven, of course. Leonard sat back, the pieces clicking into place. Greer, the courthouse, the disturbance call at the diner. It wasn't just about prejudice, it was about power. Leonard's presence in Summerview wasn't just unwelcome. It was a threat to the people who wanted to keep the town in their grip. Mitchell cleared his throat nervously. Leonard, you're stirring a hornet's nest here. Greer's sheriff now. You know what that means. Leonard's jaw tightened. It means he thinks no one's going to hold him accountable. Be careful, Mitchell said, his voice low. People like Greer don't like being questioned. Leonard's gaze was steady. Then he's going to hate what happens next. Later that afternoon, Leonard was back in his office when Camille burst through the door, her face pale. Mr. Price, there are police officers downstairs asking for you. Leonard looked up sharply. What? Camille swallowed hard. They're saying they need to bring you in for questioning. Something about fraudulent business dealings. Leonard stood slowly, his calm exterior masking the fire now burning inside him. Fraudulent dealings? He grabbed his suit jacket, sliding it on. I'll handle this. Downstairs, two uniformed officers, faces Leonard didn't recognize, stood in the sleek lobby of Price and Wade. A third figure loomed behind them, Sergeant Sean Greer. The man's presence was deliberate, his expression smug as he watched Leonard approach. Mr. Price, Greer said smoothly, hands resting on his belt. We have some questions regarding your involvement in a series of irregularities surrounding the courthouse project. Leonard stood tall, his voice even. You're accusing me of fraud? I'm not accusing you of anything, Greer replied, though the smirk on his face said otherwise. We just need to take you in for questioning. The lobby had grown quiet. Employees lingered near their desks, whispering and exchanging uneasy glances. Camille hovered nearby, her phone clenched tightly in her hand. Leonard looked at Greer, unblinking. You've got nothing, Greer. This is harassment. Greer's smile widened. You'll have a chance to explain that downtown. Unless you prefer me to cuff you here? Leonard's hands clenched at his sides, but he stayed calm. I'll come with you. The two officers stepped forward, one reaching to take Leonard's arm. That won't be necessary, Leonard said sharply, pulling back. I'm walking out of here on my own. Greer's smirk didn't waver as he gestured to the door. Then let's go. Outside, the courthouse loomed in the distance as Leonard sat in the back of a police cruiser. He stared out the window, his mind racing, though his face remained impassive. He knew what this was, a show of force, a message that Summerview's power structure wasn't to be challenged. The ride was silent, the tension thick. When they arrived at the sheriff's office, Leonard was escorted inside, where Greer waited, leaning against a desk. Let's skip the pleasantries, shall we? Greer said, pushing a folder across the desk toward Leonard. We've been reviewing some of your business dealings, Mr. Price. Seems you've made some powerful enemies. Leonard didn't bother looking at the folder. You've got nothing. This is a fishing expedition. Greer's expression darkened. You think you're untouchable because you've got money. Because you've got some fancy company? Leonard met his gaze steadily. No, I think I'm untouchable because I'm telling the truth. And you're trying to bury it. Greer leaned closer, his voice dropping. You don't belong here, Price. You never did. People like you think you can come in and take over, but Summerview doesn't change. Leonard's jaw tightened. I'm not leaving. We'll see about that. Leonard was released hours later, his lawyer having arrived to dismantle Greer's flimsy accusations. Yet, as Leonard stepped back into the fading sunlight, he knew this was far from over. Greer had escalated the fight, and Leonard could see the next steps clearly. They wanted to intimidate him, to push him out, but they had underestimated him. As Leonard climbed into his car, his phone buzzed. A message from Camille flashed on the screen. Mitchell called, says he has something you need to see. Urgent. Leonard's gaze hardened as he started the engine. The pieces were falling into place, and he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about him. This was about power, corruption, and the reckoning Summerview had avoided for far too long. And Leonard Price was done playing their game. Leonard drove toward Mitchell's office with a purpose that steadied his nerves. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over Summerview's aging streets. His car moved quietly through the town, passing brick storefronts and whitewashed homes, symbols of an unchanged past that clung stubbornly to the present. In the rearview mirror, he caught glimpses of himself, tired but resolute. The arrest had been humiliating, but Greer's intentions were clearer now. Break Leonard down, push him out, bury the truth. But Leonard Price wasn't the kind of man who backed down. When he pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Mitchell Crane was already waiting outside, his slight figure hunched nervously under the weight of whatever information he carried. He glanced up as Leonard's car approached, his face pale and anxious in the dying light. Leonard stepped out and shut the door behind him, his calm footsteps carrying him toward Mitchell. "You said it was urgent." Mitchell nodded quickly, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting to see someone watching them. "Let's talk inside. It's not safe out here." Inside the courthouse, Mitchell led Leonard to the basement, where rows of metal filing cabinets and dusty boxes lined the dimly lit space. The hum of the old fluorescent lights made the silence feel even heavier. "Mitchell, what is it?" Leonard asked, crossing his arms as Mitchell rifled through a box of papers. "Here." Mitchell pulled out a thick folder, its edges dog-eared from age. He handed it to Leonard, his hands trembling. "You were right about Greer. And you were right about the courthouse project. It's all here, contracts, payouts, falsified bids. I found it when I was archiving old files last year, but I didn't know what to do." Leonard opened the folder, his sharp eyes scanning the documents. The more he read, the clearer the corruption became. The firm that won the courthouse bid, the one Greer was tied to, had inflated their costs, siphoning money into shadow accounts. The sheriff's office had signed off on it, securing the deal in exchange for kickbacks. Names appeared in the paperwork, officials, contractors, all complicit. Greer wasn't just protecting power. He was part of it. Leonard looked up at Mitchell. "This is big." Mitchell nodded, his face pale. "I know. That's why I didn't say anything sooner. Leonard, if this comes out, it'll tear this town apart. People in high places are going to come after you. They already have," Leonard said quietly, shutting the folder. "But now I have what I need." Mitchell ran a hand through his thinning hair, his voice shaking. "You don't understand. Greer doesn't play fair. If he finds out you have this—" "I'm not afraid of Greer," Leonard said firmly. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Are you?" Mitchell swallowed hard, but something in Leonard's confidence seemed to settle him. He shook his head slowly. "No, not anymore." "Good." Leonard tucked the folder under his arm and turned toward the door. "I'll handle this." Mitchell watched him go, his expression torn between fear and relief. "Be careful, Leonard." Leonard paused at the doorway, looking back. "I will." But it's time someone stood up to them. The next morning, Leonard arrived at his office earlier than usual. The weight of the folder sat in his briefcase, and with it came a sense of urgency. He knew the risk of carrying evidence like this, but it wasn't just about him anymore. If Summerview was ever going to change, the truth needed to come to light. Camille was already at her desk when he walked in, her expression clouded with concern. "Mr. Price, there's something you need to know." Leonard paused mid-step. "What is it?" "Someone's been calling the office, asking questions about you. Anonymous." "It started late last night," she said, her voice dropping. "And this morning, 2 sheriff's deputies were outside, watching the building." Leonard's jaw tightened. "Greer." Camille nodded. "They're waiting for you to slip up. Or worse." Leonard set his briefcase on the desk and opened it, pulling out the folder. He handed it to Camille. "I need you to scan and back this up. Every page. And send copies to my attorney and Dr. Holloway's office in Atlanta." Camille's eyes widened as she glanced at the documents. "What is this?" "Proof," Leonard said. "It's what Greer and his people are trying to hide." Camille nodded, her professionalism steadying her nerves. "I'll take care of it." "Good." Leonard straightened, his voice calm but firm. And Camille, no matter what happens, don't stop. This needs to get out. Before Camille could respond, the phone on her desk rang sharply, shattering the quiet. She hesitated, then picked up the receiver. Price and Wade Enterprises. Yes, one moment. She covered the mouthpiece and looked at Leonard, her face tense. It's Sheriff Greer. He wants to speak with you. Leonard's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. Put him through. Leonard picked up the phone, his tone measured. Greer. Mr. Price. Greer's voice drawled, smug and venomous. You've been busy. Not as busy as you've been, apparently, Leonard replied coolly. There was a pause. Greer's tone hardened. Don't play games with me, Price. You're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. Leonard's grip on the phone tightened, but his voice remained calm. You mean worse than being arrested under false pretenses? Worse than being harassed by your deputies? Or do you mean worse than exposing corruption that's been bleeding this town dry? You think you're a hero? Greer snapped. You're nothing but an outsider who doesn't know when to leave well enough alone. People like you. People like me? Leonard interrupted, his voice sharp now. Say what you mean, Greer. There was silence on the other end of the line. When Greer spoke again, his voice was cold. You'll regret this, Price. You don't know who you're up against. Leonard's gaze hardened. I know exactly who I'm up against, and I'm not going anywhere. Greer hung up abruptly, the dial tone humming in Leonard's ear. By midday, the storm had begun to brew. Word spread that Leonard Price was asking questions, dangerous questions. Contractors he'd worked with suddenly stopped answering calls. Meetings were canceled. Whispers filled the courthouse, the diner, and even the country club. Places Leonard had once moved through with quiet authority now buzzed with suspicion. Camille entered Leonard's office just after lunch, her face tense. It's done, she said, holding up a thumb drive. The files are backed up, and copies have been sent to your attorney in DR. Holloway. But, Leonard looked up. But what? There's someone in the parking lot. A black SUV. They've been sitting there for an hour, watching the building. Leonard's expression didn't change, though his pulse quickened. He walked to the window and peered through the blinds. Sure enough, a black SUV idled at the edge of the lot, its windows tinted. Greer wasn't wasting time. Leonard turned back to Camille. I need you to leave early today. Take the back exit. Don't go home. Go to your sister's place in Atlanta. Stay there tonight. Camille's brow furrowed. Mr. Price, I can't just... You can, Leonard said firmly. They're not going to come after you, but I'm not taking any chances. Camille hesitated, but finally nodded. Okay, what about you? Leonard's smile was faint, but unshakable. I'll be fine. That evening, Leonard parked his car outside the Summerview courthouse once again. The street was deserted, save for the faint flicker of lamplights and the low rumble of distant thunder. The black SUV was gone now, but Leonard felt no relief. The real fight was about to begin. He climbed the courthouse steps slowly, the folder tucked securely under his arm. Inside, the lights were dim, the halls empty. Leonard knew where he was going, the sheriff's office. He stepped through the doorway, finding Greer behind his desk, as though he had been waiting for him. The room was quiet, save for the creak of Leonard's footsteps on the old wood floor. Greer looked up, a smirk spreading across his face. You're a stubborn man, Price. Leonard set the folder down on Greer's desk with deliberate precision. And you're a corrupt one. This ends tonight. Greer's expression faltered, his gaze flicking to the folder. Leonard didn't move, his presence like iron forged in fire. Your move, Sheriff. The storm outside cracked, lightning splitting the sky as Greer stared at the evidence. Leonard didn't blink, didn't waver. He was done waiting. The silence in the sheriff's office was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Leonard stood tall, his shoulders squared as Greer stared at the folder sitting ominously on the desk between them. Outside, the distant growl of thunder rumbled through Summerview, as if the storm itself knew what was about to unfold. Greer's smirk faltered, his fingers tapping restlessly against the edge of his desk. You've got some nerve walking in here like this, Price. His tone was sharp, but Leonard heard the tension laced beneath it, fear masked as arrogance. I'm not here to argue, Greer, Leonard replied calmly, though the fire simmering beneath his steady exterior was unmistakable. I'm here to tell you this ends tonight. The kickbacks, the fraud, the harassment. You and your people have been bleeding this town dry while protecting your own interests. Greer's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. Careful, Price. You're tossing around some dangerous accusations. They're not accusations. Leonard's voice cut through the room like a blade. They're facts. Your name is all over those documents. So is your deputy's. The firm you pushed through on that courthouse bid. Shell accounts, money flowing straight back to you. Greer leaned back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face, as if he'd decided to play a different hand. You really think waving around a few pieces of paper changes anything? You don't know this town, Price. People here don't care about your files or your accusations. They care about loyalty. They trust me, not some outsider who thinks money gives him power. Leonard stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. They trust you because they don't know the truth. You've built your little empire on lies, Greer, and I'm going to tear it down. Greer's smile vanished. He shot up from his chair, so quickly it scraped loudly against the floor. And how do you plan to do that? He snapped, his voice low and threatening. You think walking in here with a file makes you untouchable? You think anyone's going to believe you over me? I don't need them to believe me, Leonard said quietly, his calm words contrasting the storm raging in Greer's eyes. I just need the truth to be out there. I've already sent this to my attorney, to journalists in Atlanta, to people who will care. Greer's expression froze, a flicker of panic breaking through his mask of control. You're bluffing. Leonard pulled his phone from his pocket and held it up, the screen glowing. I don't bluff. It's already in motion. Greer's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know what you're doing, Price. You're trying to burn down this town over what? Your ego. Because I didn't roll out the red carpet for you? Leonard's eyes flashed. I'm doing this because people like you think you're untouchable. You hide behind your badge, your connections, and your corruption. You thought I'd back down because I don't belong in your world. But I'm not afraid of you. Greer's composure cracked like glass. He rounded the desk, stepping into Leonard's space, his voice a low growl. You think you can take me down, boy? You think this ends with a folder full of documents? His words dripped with venom now, years of prejudice spilling into the open. You don't belong here. You never have. This town will never see you as anything but an outsider. Leonard didn't move. He didn't flinch. He met Greer's hatred with a calm strength that turned the sheriff's fury into desperation. I don't need to belong, Leonard said, his voice quiet but resolute. I just need to be heard. Greer's face twisted with rage, and for a split second, Leonard saw the man's mask fall completely. Greer reached for the phone clipped to his belt, his intent clear, to call his deputies, to escalate this beyond words. Leonard's pulse quickened, his instincts flaring like an alarm. Think carefully about what you're about to do, Leonard warned, his voice steady. Because this time, you won't get away with it. Greer hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio. The tension between them snapped taut, the room shrinking around the two men. Leonard could see the battle behind Greer's eyes, whether to unleash the force of his office or retreat. Then the door burst open. Sheriff, a deputy rushed inside, his face flushed. There's a situation. Reporters just showed up outside. From Atlanta. Greer froze, his entire body going rigid. What? He barked. They're asking about the courthouse project, the renovation contracts. The deputy continued, looking nervously at Leonard. They say someone sent them documents. Leonard allowed himself a faint smile, though his eyes remained locked on Greer's. I told you, he said softly. The truth always comes out. Greer turned slowly, his face a mask of barely contained fury. For a moment, Leonard thought the man might lash out physically, but instead, Greer jabbed a finger in his direction. You think you've won? Greer hissed. You have no idea what you've started. No, Leonard said, his tone unwavering. You started this. I'm just finishing it. Greer spun on his heel, storming past the deputy and out the door, barking orders as he went. Leonard watched him go, his shoulders finally loosening as the room emptied. Outside the sheriff's office, the rain had started again, a light drizzle falling as Leonard stepped into the gray afternoon. A small crowd had gathered, a handful of townspeople lingering near the steps, craning their necks as reporters unpacked their cameras and notepads. Camille was waiting at the edge of the lot, a familiar black umbrella shielding her from the rain. She hurried to Leonard's side, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "You did it," she said, her voice soft. "The reporters are here. They're asking questions." Leonard nodded, scanning the scene. Greer won't go quietly. He'll fight this with everything he has. Camille frowned. "Do you think he'll try to pin this on you again?" Leonard glanced toward the building, where Greer's shadow moved behind the glass. "He might, but he can't stop what's already in motion." The low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance as Leonard stepped down the courthouse stairs. He passed the townspeople, some of whom averted their eyes, others who whispered in his wake. It didn't matter. Their doubt, their assumptions, their discomfort with his very presence. It didn't matter anymore. "Mr. Price." A reporter approached, a microphone in hand, her cameraman close behind. "Can you comment on the documents alleging corruption in the sheriff's office?" Leonard paused, turning to face her. Rain dotted the shoulders of his suit, but he didn't care. He looked directly into the camera, his voice calm and firm. "This is just the beginning," Leonard said. "Summerview deserves better, and the people who have been taking advantage of this town will be held accountable." The reporter opened her mouth to ask another question, but Leonard was already walking away. Camille followed, her quiet presence steadying him as they moved through the rain. "Where to now?" Camille asked softly. Leonard didn't hesitate. "Home. I need to prepare for what comes next." Because Leonard knew Greer wouldn't back down. Men like him, entitled, emboldened by unchecked power, never did. Greer would try to spin the story, to undermine the truth Leonard had exposed. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was about to get uglier. But Leonard Price wasn't afraid. He had faced men like Greer his whole life, men who believed they could define him, diminish him. They had underestimated him then, and they were underestimating him now. As he climbed into his car, the rain drumming softly against the roof, Leonard felt the weight of the moment settle into him. This was no longer just about corruption. It was about respect, about truth, about standing tall in a town that had tried to silence him. Greer had lit the fire. Leonard was going to make sure it burned clean. The Summerview courthouse was alive with tension as Leonard approached its towering, weathered facade. The rain had stopped, but the storm wasn't over, at least not for him. A small group of reporters loitered outside, cameras at the ready, their hushed voices mixing with the hum of the evening air. Leonard strode through them without hesitation, his mind focused on the fight that awaited him inside. Greer was cornered now, and cornered men made dangerous choices. Inside, the sheriff's office buzzed with a simmering unease. Deputies glanced up from their desks, some pretending to shuffle papers while others openly stared as Leonard walked past. It wasn't just curiosity, it was fear. Fear of what he represented. Fear of what he was about to do. At the far end of the hall, Greer's office door stood ajar. Leonard didn't bother knocking. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Greer sat behind his desk, his broad frame hunched as he rifled through stacks of paperwork. His eyes shot up at Leonard's entrance, narrowing into slits. A sneer tugged at his lips as he leaned back in his chair, feigning calm. "You don't know when to quit, do you, Price?" Greer said, his voice a low growl. "I'd almost admire it if it wasn't so damn pathetic." Leonard ignored the insult, shutting the door behind him. "We're past the point of games, Greer. You know it, and I know it." Greer's smile faltered, just a flicker of doubt breaking through his bravado. "What do you want, Price?" Leonard stepped forward, placing a thumb drive on Greer's desk with deliberate precision. "Everything I have, contracts, payment trails, statements. It's all there. I've already sent copies to the state attorney's office and the Atlanta Journal. By tomorrow, this story will be on every news outlet in Georgia." For the first time, Greer looked rattled. His fingers twitched against the armrest of his chair. "You think you're so damn righteous, don't you?" His voice dipped, venom pooling in each word. "You think this town's going to cheer for you when you burn it to the ground. You don't belong here, Price. You never did." You're kind. My kind. Leonard cut him off, his voice sharp, controlled. Say it, Greer. Tell me exactly what you mean. Greer hesitated, the words on the edge of his tongue, before slamming his fist onto the desk. You want to make this about race, fine. You people come in thinking you can take what you want, our contracts, our businesses, our way of life. And I'm supposed to just roll over for you. Leonard didn't flinch, though the words landed like blows meant to break him. This isn't about your way of life. It's about your corruption, your lies, the way you and your cronies siphoned money from this town while pretending you were its protectors. Greer stood abruptly, his chair scraping back against the floor. The air between them crackled, charged with the unspoken tension of decades of systemic rot. You have no idea what you're up against. You think people are going to believe you over me. I've been in this town my whole life, Price. People trust me. You're just another outsider with a little too much money and a big mouth. Leonard met Greer's glare without blinking, the weight of the moment settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about the courthouse contract anymore. It was about every time a man like Greer had silenced someone who dared to speak out. About every black family in Summerview who had learned to stay quiet to survive. Leonard spoke, his voice steady but heavy with conviction. Your time is up, Greer. The days where men like you could hide behind a badge and your good OL boys club are over. You're going to answer for every dollar you stole and every person you hurt. Greer laughed bitterly, shaking his head as he moved around the desk. You really don't get it, do you? This town will tear itself apart before it lets someone like you decide what happens next. Greer's words hung in the air as he stalked closer, his large frame looming over Leonard. You think you can walk in here, throw around accusations, and walk out? You're in my house, Price. You don't call the shots here. Leonard's eyes narrowed as he stood his ground. That's where you're wrong. The truth calls the shots now. Greer's face twisted, his fury boiling over. Without warning, he lunged, grabbing Leonard by the collar and shoving him hard against the door. The impact rattled the wood, but Leonard didn't fight back. His breath hissed out, but his eyes stayed locked on Greer's, calm and unshakable. You think you're untouchable? Greer snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I'll ruin you, Price. You won't have a job, a company. Hell, you won't have a reputation left when I'm done. Leonard's voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. You've already ruined yourself. Greer froze, his grip loosening as realization began to dawn. Leonard tilted his head just slightly, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Your deputies saw you attack me, Leonard said softly. They're standing right outside the door. Greer's face went pale. He turned sharply toward the window, where shadows shifted on the other side of the frosted glass. The sound of boots echoed in the hall, and the muffled crackle of a police radio broke the silence. You. Greer's voice was a whisper now, the rage draining into something like disbelief. Leonard smoothed his collar as Greer backed away from him, stumbling slightly as he turned toward the door. Before he could speak, the door opened, and two deputies stepped inside, their expressions blank but their posture firm. Sheriff, one of them said, his voice clipped. You're going to need to come with us. Greer spun on them, his face flushed with a mix of anger and desperation. What the hell is this? Do you know who you're talking to? The deputies didn't flinch. Sir, we have orders from the state attorney's office. They're launching an investigation into the courthouse contracts. You'll need to come downtown for questioning. Greer's chest heaved, his eyes darting from Leonard to the deputies as if searching for a way out. But there was none. Leonard watched him, calm and composed as the sheriff's empire began to crumble. This isn't over, Greer shouted, his voice cracking as the deputies flanked him. You hear me, Price? This isn't over. Leonard stood tall, his gaze unwavering. Yes, it is. Greer struggled as they led him out, his shouts echoing through the halls of the sheriff's office. Deputies and staff watched in stunned silence as their leader, Summerview's self-proclaimed protector, was marched out like a criminal. Some looked at Leonard with quiet respect. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to face what had just happened. Leonard let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. He knew this wasn't the end. Greer's arrest would expose the rot, but the fight wasn't over. not for Summerview, and not for him. Corruption didn't vanish overnight. It would take more than headlines and handcuffs to repair what had been broken. But it was a start. Outside, the storm clouds had begun to break, the sun peeking through as Leonard stepped into the cool evening air. Reporters surged toward him, their cameras rolling, microphones thrust in his direction. "Mr. Price, do you have a comment about Sheriff Greer's arrest?" Leonard paused on the courthouse steps, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. Behind them, townspeople had gathered, murmuring among themselves. He saw doubt in their faces, but also something else, curiosity, maybe even hope. He turned to the reporters, his voice calm and clear. "The people of Summerview deserve better. They deserve leaders they can trust. What happened here today is only the beginning." As he walked toward his car, Camille was waiting by the curb, her expression a mix of pride and relief. She opened the door for him, shaking her head with a smile. "You did it," she said softly. Leonard nodded, sliding into the driver's seat. "We did it." But as he pulled away from the courthouse, Leonard's gaze lingered on the town stretching out before him. He had won this battle, but the road ahead would be long. There were more Greers out there, more systems built to keep men like Leonard silent. He wouldn't stop now. Leonard Price had faced the storm, and he was still standing. The news spread like wildfire. By the following morning, Sheriff Greer's arrest was the lead story on every regional outlet and national wire service. The courthouse scandal, a tangled web of kickbacks, embezzlement, and abuse of power, had been exposed. Headlines screamed the truth Leonard had fought to bring to light. Small-town sheriff at center of corruption scandal. Whistleblower shakes up Summerview's power structure. Leonard Price, the man who took a stand. Leonard sat in his office at Price and Wade Enterprises, the hum of the television in the background as reporters dissected every angle of the case. Camille stood nearby, her laptop open as messages and press requests flooded in. "They're calling it a watershed moment for Summerview," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "The state attorney's office is opening a full investigation into the sheriff's department. Contractors, deputies, local politicians, everyone tied to Greer is being dragged into the spotlight." Leonard nodded slowly, though his face remained calm. "Good. It's about time." Camille hesitated, glancing at him. "And you? How are you holding up?" Leonard looked out the window, his gaze sweeping over the town he had spent his life trying to uplift. Summerview looked the same. Quiet streets, familiar rooftops, storefronts with peeling paint, but it felt different now. The ground beneath it had shifted. "I'm fine," Leonard said, though his voice was softer. "We did what we had to do. People are starting to see the truth." 2 days later, Leonard returned to the courthouse, this time not to fight but to watch the next stage of justice unfold. The small courtroom was packed. Deputies, townspeople, local reporters, and city officials all sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering as they awaited the arraignment. Sheriff Greer, no longer in uniform, sat at the defendant's table. His face was haggard, his eyes red from sleepless nights, but the arrogance that once defined him was gone. Leonard stood at the back of the room, hands clasped loosely in front of him. Mitchell Crane, the hesitant but redeemed courthouse clerk, stood beside him. "I still can't believe he's finally here," Mitchell whispered, glancing at Greer. "The man thought he was untouchable." "People like Greer always think that," Leonard replied quietly, "until someone proves them wrong." The judge entered, and the room fell silent as Greer was formally charged. Leonard watched as the words were spoken aloud. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of power. Each charge landed like a hammer blow. For all the damage Greer had done, for all the families he had wronged, for the businesses he had bled dry, justice was finally at his doorstep. When it was over, Greer was led from the room in handcuffs, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. As he passed Leonard, their eyes met for just a moment. Leonard saw no fight left in him, just defeat. Outside the courthouse, the day was bright and clear, the sun cutting through the remnants of storm clouds that still lingered on the horizon. A crowd had gathered, cheering as Greer was escorted into the waiting police car. Reporters jostled for position, snapping photos and shouting questions, but Leonard didn't linger. He stepped onto the sidewalk where townspeople were beginning to gather. Faces that had once watched him with suspicion or doubt now turned to him with something different: curiosity, respect, even gratitude. A man in his 60s, wearing a dusty work jacket and faded cap, approached Leonard hesitantly. "Mr. Price." Leonard turned to him, his expression calm. "Yes." The man rubbed his hands together, as if unsure of how to speak. I just wanted to say thank you. A lot of us knew something was wrong, but we didn't know how to fight it. You did." Leonard gave a small nod. "It took all of us to bring the truth out, but I appreciate that." The man's weathered face broke into a faint smile. "You ain't just an outsider anymore, Mr. Price." Leonard watched him walk away, the words settling into his chest. He had spent years being told he didn't belong here, that his success, his wealth, his mere presence in Summerview was an affront to its traditions. And yet, in that moment, Leonard realized something profound. He had earned his place, not through force or power, but through resilience and truth. Back at his office, Leonard found Camille waiting with an envelope in her hand. "This just came in," she said, holding it out. "It's from a state attorney's office." Leonard opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the neatly printed letter. It was official confirmation that Greer's case had been escalated to a full criminal trial. Investigators were digging into the sheriff's office, the courthouse contracts, and even other departments tied to Greer's network. "The system is starting to crack," Camille said, watching him. "Do you think it'll change for good?" Leonard folded the letter and set it on his desk. "Change is slow. People like Greer don't build power overnight, and it won't disappear overnight either. But this is a start." Camille nodded, her face thoughtful. "And you? What's next for you?" Leonard smiled faintly, glancing out the window. "I'm not going anywhere." A week later, Leonard attended a town hall meeting at Summerview's community center. It was the first of its kind in years, organized by local leaders who had finally found their voices in the wake of Greer's fall. The room was full, people sitting shoulder to shoulder, many of them whispering and trading cautious glances. Leonard stood at the back, observing quietly. He had no intention of taking the spotlight. That wasn't why he'd fought. But as the meeting began, people turned to look at him, their gazes lingering with something more than recognition. They weren't just seeing Leonard Price, the wealthy CEO. They were seeing a man who had refused to stay silent, a man who had fought for something greater than himself. Midway through the meeting, a woman in her 40s stood up. Leonard recognized her as the owner of a small bakery on Main Street. "I just want to say that we can't go back to the way things were," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "We let people like Sheriff Greer run this town for too long because we were afraid to speak up. But that's over now." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We need people who will stand up for what's right," she continued, turning her gaze to Leonard. "People like Mr. Price." The room broke into applause, scattered at first but growing louder. Leonard felt Camille's eyes on him as he stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but deeply moved. When the applause died down, Leonard stepped forward slowly. The crowd hushed, all eyes on him as he reached the podium. "I didn't come to Summerview to fight corruption," Leonard began, his deep voice carrying through the quiet room. "I came here to build something, a business, a community. But I learned that sometimes you can't build until you tear down what's broken." He looked out over the room, his gaze steady. "What happened with Sheriff Greer isn't just about him. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of town we want to be, the kind of leaders we choose to trust. The truth is, this fight isn't over. There's still work to do." A ripple of agreement ran through the room. "But I believe this town can change. I believe we can be better. And I'll be here to help make that happen." Leonard stepped back as applause filled the room again. He didn't need to say more. The seed of change had already been planted, and Leonard Price would be there to see it grow. That evening, Leonard stood outside his office, watching the sun set over Summerview. The horizon glowed in shades of orange and gold, a promise of something new. Camille joined him, her voice soft. "Think they'll listen?" "They already are," Leonard replied. The town wasn't fixed. It wouldn't be tomorrow or the next day, But the silence had been broken, and the first step towards something better had been taken. Leonard Price had fought for respect. And now, for the first time, he felt it. Leonard Price stood on the steps of his office, watching as the town of Summerview settled into the golden glow of dusk. The quiet hum of life moved around him, cars rolling slowly down the streets, shop doors swinging open as families drifted in and out, and laughter from children chasing each other across the square. On the surface, nothing seemed to have changed, but Leonard knew better. The roots of corruption that had plagued this town for decades were finally exposed. Sheriff Greer's arrest and the revelations of fraud, kickbacks, and abuse of power had sent ripples through Summerview. It wasn't just about Greer. It was about a system that had allowed men like him to thrive. A system that quietly told people like Leonard to know their place. But Leonard refused to listen. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the evening breeze wash over him. For years, Summerview had pushed him to the margins. Whispers behind his back, polite smiles hiding resentment, and obstacles placed in his path. Yet here he stood, unshaken. He opened his eyes and stepped back inside, finding Camille waiting by his desk. She wore her usual calm expression, but there was a spark of pride in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Press requests are still rolling in," she said, setting a folder on his desk. "Everyone wants to talk about how you took Greer down." Leonard chuckled softly, shaking his head as he loosened his tie. "They're giving me too much credit. This fight was never just about me." "Maybe," Camille replied, crossing her arms, "but you were the one who stood up when everyone else was too afraid." Leonard looked at her thoughtfully. "Fear has a way of keeping people quiet, Camille. It takes time to undo that kind of silence." She nodded, her face serious now. "You think Summerview's ready to change?" Leonard exhaled slowly. "Some are, some aren't. But the important thing is that the truth is out there now. And once you shine a light on something, it's a lot harder for people to look away." The next morning, Leonard found himself back at the diner on Magnolia and Elm. The little bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the past few weeks lift just slightly. The familiar smell of bacon grease and coffee wrapped around him like a warm embrace. Martha looked up from behind the counter, a smile spreading across her face as she spotted him. "Well, look who decided to grace us with his presence." Leonard smiled faintly and took his usual seat at the counter. "Good morning, Martha." Martha poured him a steaming cup of coffee, her tone softer now. "You've had quite the week, Lenny. People are finally talking about things they've kept buried for years." "They needed to talk," Leonard replied, wrapping his hands around the mug. This town couldn't move forward until people faced the truth. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You know, when you came back to Summerview, I thought you were wasting your time. Thought you'd pack up and leave once things got hard, just like most folks who try to change this place." Leonard looked at her, his gaze steady. "And now?" Martha met his eyes with a small smile. "Now, I think you're exactly what this town needed. Someone who wasn't afraid to shake things up." The door chimed again, and Leonard turned to see a father and his young son enter. The boy darted past Leonard, laughing as he slid into a booth. His father nodded politely at Leonard before sitting across from the boy. It was such a small moment, ordinary even, but something about it struck Leonard. That boy would grow up in a Summerview that was a little less broken, a little more honest, because someone had dared to speak up. The thought settled deep in Leonard's chest, a mix of pride and determination. Over the next few weeks, the dust began to settle, though the scars remained. Deputies implicated in the scandal resigned or were suspended pending investigation. Local contractors came forward with their own stories of coercion, revealing just how far Greer's corruption had spread. The town began to reckon with the truth, piece by piece. At the same time, something remarkable happened. People started to speak up. The town council announced plans for an independent review of the sheriff's office. Small businesses that had once struggled under Greer's influence began to see a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, Summerview felt as though it was waking up from a long slumber. Leonard watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction, though he never sought recognition. The headlines would fade, and the world would move on. But he knew the work was far from over. One evening, Leonard found himself at a town hall meeting, this time seated quietly among the crowd instead of standing at the podium. The room buzzed with a sense of cautious optimism. People spoke openly about issues they had once been too afraid to confront: accountability in local government, transparency in leadership, and opportunities for the next generation. An older woman stood up, her voice strong despite her age. "This isn't just about Greer. It's about the way we've let things slide for too long. We need leaders who work for us, not for themselves." Applause followed her words, and Leonard couldn't help but feel a swell of hope. This was what he had fought for, not just justice, but change. The kind of change that began with one voice and grew louder until no one could ignore it. After the meeting, people approached Leonard, shaking his hand, thanking him. A young man, no more than 20, stopped him near the door. "Mr. Price," he said nervously, "I just wanted to say, you inspire people like me. To not back down, to stand up for what's right." Leonard smiled, the weight of the moment settling into him. "Don't wait for permission to do what's right," he replied. "The world doesn't change unless people like you make it change." As the weeks turned into months, Leonard's life fell back into its familiar rhythm. He returned to his work at Price and Wade, overseeing projects that brought real opportunity to towns like Summerview. But something had shifted in him. The fight with Greer had tested him, revealed parts of himself he hadn't fully known: the depths of his resolve, the strength of his patience, and the power of his voice. He had always been a builder, but now he saw his purpose more clearly. He wasn't just building structures. He was helping build a foundation for something better. One afternoon, Leonard stood at the edge of a construction site just outside Summerview, a new community center that Price and Wade had partnered with the town to build. The sound of hammers and machinery filled the air, and Leonard smiled faintly as he watched workers move with purpose. Camille joined him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "It's coming together," she said. "It is," Leonard replied, his gaze steady. "This is just the beginning." Camille looked at him curiously. "You think you'll ever leave Summerview?" Leonard thought for a moment before shaking his head. "No, I'm right where I need to be." He turned to look at the horizon, where Summerview stretched out in all its flawed, imperfect beauty. There was still work to be done, but Leonard Price wasn't afraid of it. He had proven that change was possible, that respect wasn't given. It was earned, fought for, and built over time. And no matter how long it took, Leonard would be there to see it through. As the sun began to set, Leonard walked to his car, his footsteps steady and unhurried. He paused to look back at the site, the future taking shape one brick at a time. A cool breeze swept through the air, carrying with it the quiet hum of progress. Summerview was changing, and so was he.